Hey everybody, Travis here. Today we're going to be taking a look at the Zelda timeline and explaining how Ocarina of Time fits into the timeline. So in this episode, I'm pretty much just going to explain to you how Ocarina of Time ends from start to finish, and then kind of explain, why the games that branch off after that are pretty much the way they are. So some people get confused with the hero is dead and like Wind Waker and Majora's Mask take place. It's really easy to understand when you really look at it from a distance. But anyways, so let's just think of it like this. So the beginning of Ocarina of Time is that there is a dream that happens. Link is, a child, 10 years old in Ocarina of Time. So we'll refer to him as the Ocarina of Time Link. He's not just an adult yet. So the same Link that would later go off to save Hyrule in Ocarina of Time, the way the game starts off is the game starts off by like you see like an ominous dark like they talk about like the Great Deku Tree is like explaining ahead of time like the whole timeline, like the whole story. Like there was a mother that left her baby to be watched over, because later on destiny would follow that this Link would be able to save Hyrule. So then, as time went on, Link aged because he wasn't. See, the Great Deku Tree watches over what is known as the Kokiris. The Kokiri children never age. Now, it's actually debatable if they can physically die if they were to get stabbed, for example. But the idea is that they never, like, time never passes in their realm, so therefore they still stay a child forever. But that doesn't mean they're necessarily immortal either. But anyways, so Link finds out that he's not a Kokiri, therefore he ages. So in other words, he's a Hylian. He is he's part of the royal bloodline, or rather, at least associated with it, because he comes from Hyrule, and Hyrule is obviously a beautiful land that is always under attack by the outsiders of the trilogy. So, in other words, Link goes on a quest after he finds out that there was an evil man that put a curse on the Great Deku Tree, and he met Navi, the fairy who everybody knows. Because again, Ocarina of Time is very well played. A lot of people know how the game goes. So we know that Link tries to save the Great Deku Tree, finds out that it doesn't, he can't save it in enough time, but it wasn't his fault because Ganondorf, the guy who pretty much laid the curse on the Great Deku Tree, came and said that he give me the Kokiri Emerald, otherwise you'll suffer a curse. And he did it anyways because he didn't tell him where it was at, even though he had it. So he gives it to Link, and then later on they venture off to the castle of Hyrule. They sneak in, they meet Zelda when she's young, and they mention how Zelda was spying on Ganondorf and that the king doesn't understand. They have an alliance with this. They have an alliance with Ganondorf. But what's really interesting is they don't really know who he is yet, though. And he talks about like how he can promise them all these things, and obviously it leads to betrayal, and he ends up overtaking Hyrule 7 years later. But before this all happens, though, Zelda has a dream, and she can predict the future, and they try to tell, she tries to tell her father this, but she thinks that she's lying and that she's just a child, and so, obviously Zelda and Link decided to do something about it themselves because they didn't think anybody else would really trust them. So she told Link that, in order to defeat Ganon, you have to get the Master Sword, or essentially. But she would, but in order to get the Master Sword, though, they had to open up the door of time, and they had to gather the other three emeralds, or the other two emeralds at this point. So Link had to go all the way up to Death Mountain all by himself, and he met the city, the Gorons, which are rock people. And then eventually, after he helped them out with their dilemmas, he would venture back then he'd have to go to Zora's domain. But in order to get to Zora's domain, she had to teach him a song, Zelda's Lullaby, or Impa did, rather. So then later on, we find out that after Link goes to Zora's domain, and we find out that, he meets Princess Ruto, which technically speaking, they give him after he saves Princess Ruto from Jabu's. I think it's Jabu. I had to look it up again. Anyways, he's a giant fish that the that the Zoras, which are also essentially fish people, that they manage to that they put inside Zora's domain. So, anyways, after you save Princess Ruto, she gives Link the ruby. She gives him the Zora Sapphire, which is actually supposed to be an engagement ring thing. That was funny, but anyways, Link gets all 3 stones, and he's supposed to head over to the bridge. But then he has that dream, like at the beginning of the game, and I can't believe I forgot to explain that. Where like he has like this dream in his treehouse, where he's sitting here talking about how he, like, you know, he meets Ganondorf like in his dreams, and then eventually he meets Ganondorf in person. And, you know, but Zelda throws the Ocarina of Time inside the water to the right side of the bridge. But then Ganondorf says he lost her. But, you know, then he sees you and he demands that you tell them which way they went. But then, you know, being that, you know, Link doesn't want to tell him anything because he obviously knows that's not going to happen. You know, Ganondorf shows him what he can do. And then he kind of applauds him for trying the best he can to save him. But then, you know, because, you know, Ganondorf tells Link that, you know, because he doesn't really believe that he can't stop him. Nobody can stop Ganondorf. You know, so Ganondorf tells Link that, you know, he's like, my name is Ganondorf, and he's like, and this land is mine now. Because, you know, nobody can stop Ganondorf, because nobody could really kill him, and everybody was scared of him, too. But, you know, Link would eventually go get the Master Sword after he opens up the Ocarina, you know. But then after he grabs the Master Sword, after the door opens up, I guess it's technically debatable when Ganondorf came back, but eventually Ganondorf came back and he led Zelda, like Zelda led Link to the Temple of Time, and then Link led Ganondorf to the Temple of Time, and, you know, as soon as he grabbed the Master Sword, like he went 7 years in the future, but he slept for 7 years. And so Ganondorf, like, because the way the game works is, like, once, you know, the pedestal is what seals the door of time to the sacred realm. But as soon as that door opens up, and as soon as you grab the Master Sword, there's technically 2 doors that lead to the door of the sacred realm. But once the Master Sword is lifted out of its pedestal, another door technically opens up and leads to the sacred realm. And Ganondorf went in there, and I guess somehow he found the Triforce. And then, you know, 7 years go by. Well, he couldn't technically get all 3 of the Triforce, because, again, it splits whenever. So he technically has to find the other 2. So, you know, Link got the Triforce of Courage, and then Zelda got the Triforce of Wisdom. And so Zelda and them knew that they had to do something about it. So she ran off somewhere. We don't see her for a while. But the idea is that when Link wakes up again, he slept for 7 years. Earth years. So now he's 17 at this point. The Master Sword kind of had a mind of its own. You know, much like the legend of the Sword of Arthur, the Sword of Excalibur, King Arthur, the Sword of Excalibur stated that the man who could pull the sword from the stone would be king. And the sword would only open you could only sheath it from the rock when it felt that it was truly ready. And then, you know, like, obviously people would gather around and try to do it. But none could budge it, though. But only one person could do it, because they figured it was a chosen one that was needed. So if you think about it, you know, the Master Sword kind of works the same way. Only so many people could pull it. And the Master Sword, when it thought it was ready, it would be able to, you could pull it from its pedestal. And Link obviously could do this even at his age, but, you know, because he was too young, the Master Sword thought, well, you know, he's too young to be the hero, so, you know, they sent him into sleep for 17 years, because then he could wield it with one hand instead of 2. But, you know, it kind of sucked, because that time allowed Ganondorf to essentially go and take over Hyrule. So when Link gets out of the Temple of Time, well, he meets several characters. He meets the and I can't remember his name off the top of my head. The Light Sage. of the Sacred Realm. You know, he essentially tells you like what had happened, and tells Link, you know, all these things that had happened, and that, you know, he must go on a journey and wake the other 7 sages, or the other 6 sages. And at the same time, though, hold on a second. Okay, sorry about that. I had a package that just came. But anyways, so what had happened was, after Link had done that, though, you know, they explained pretty much the whole trilogy of like what had happened, you know, up until this point in the 7 years he was sleeping. And the world that you know of is much different than what you have last saw, because Ganondorf, and he destroyed stuff and all these, and he actually made alliances with some people and all this other crazy nonsense. But anyways, Link decides, you know, his next mission is that he is going to have to go back to all the places that he's been, and he's going to have to try and, you know, fix all the problems that had happened up until this point. It's his job as the hero. So in Ocarina of Time, we find out that, like, for example, then he has to go wake the 7 sages. But before the sages, he talks about how the wise man tells Link that, or the Sage of Light tells Link that to awaken the other sages, they are going to be people that you probably knew dearest to you, and you might probably lose them because once they're awakened as a sage, they can't return to the real world. So in other words, they're essentially already dead, is what he's saying. And keep this in mind for later on, because this is when the game kind of gets really confusing to explain. So Link goes to the Forest Temple. Well, before he goes to the Forest Temple, he has to go to the Kokoriko Graveyard. He meets Dampé, the Graveyard Keeper, but at this point he's already dead. Now, technically speaking, Link had to go into... he had to go back. He could go back to the forest, Kokoriko Village, and you would find out that all the entire forest was just overrun by just all these things from these common enemies you would find in the Forest Temple. So the whole thing was just out of control. Nobody was outside playing because it was like a threat everywhere they go. And so, and after that, everybody is trying to just figure out how to survive through this. So anyways, Link had to go, and I mean, there was several things Link did when he was a kid that, you know, I left out, but, you know, like, you get the idea, though. You know, he met certain people, and then later on, he, you know, his friend Syria, you know, it's debatable if she really loved Link, even though she was a Kokiri and he was a Hylian, so she never aged, but he did. But technically speaking, you know, she died when she did. I think she died at the age of 10, if I'm not mistaken. And then Link was 17 by the time, you know, he came to this realization, because he wasn't there for 7 years. But she wasn't dead when he was a kid, though. So the idea is that she was the Forest Temple Sage. But at the same time, though, before Link came to the Forest Temple, he met another mysterious person after he left the Sacred Realm chamber. It was known as the, you know, he met a person by the name of Sheik. And Sheik claims to be a man in this case, which, you know, the Sheikans are a very mysterious race. And Sheik knows a lot of information. Tells Link that, you know, he you know, as his role as the hero, he's going to have to try even harder. You know, what he experienced when he was a kid wasn't anything what he's going to be seeing now. So essentially, you know, things just got harder for him. So he has to go to the Forest Temple, he has to go to the Fire Temple, he has to go to the Water Temple, the Shadow Temple, the Spirit Temple, and then finally he has everything he needs, or at least everything along the way anyways. And then finally he can go figure out where Ganondorf's at and figure out all this nonsense, and then get to him, kill him, and then, you know, finally rid the world of all the crap he's done. So, at least in this timeline anyways. So, we find out that the sages that are followed, we have Syria as the forest sage. We have, I forget how to pronounce his name, but it starts with a D, the leader of the Gorons, that Link was given the bracelets for, so that way he could lift bomb flowers we were also, and then we see Princess Rudo was the sage of the water sage. Impa was the Shadow Temple sage, and then the woman that was the leader of all the Gerudos, which despise Ganon at this point, even though they made him king, so his own race essentially. She essentially didn't like Ganondorf, and I forget her name. It starts with an N. It's like Naburo or something like that. I forget her name. But it's essentially what had happened was she was the one that she didn't like Ganondorf, but eventually Ganondorf's godmothers, the Twin Norva, I forget their names, the witch doctors. But after Link stopped them too, Ganondorf couldn't stop Link either. So, but anyways, so the idea is that this is okay. And just to give you a nutshell, after Link fights Ganondorf, saves Zelda, after she reveals she's Sheik, then we find out that, well, let's be honest, Link kills all these things and stops Ganondorf. They seal him away, and then Zelda sends him back 7 years into the past. But something's really interesting here, and this is something that I've noticed that some people even get wrong. When Link goes back 7 years, and again, this is where things will start getting confusing. Okay, so this is at the end of Ocarina of Time. We are back at the beginning of the game. But at the beginning of the game, though, we can still debatably say that the Great Deku Tree... Think of it like this. Link goes back in time after we find out that the whole reason why he went through the whole adventure in the first place of Ocarina of Time was to fix what happened at the beginning of the game, or the first half at least. So Link goes back in time, armed with all the knowledge that he's gained throughout the whole game, and meets Zelda for the first time. But, because of the dream thing, we pretty much know how this works. And then the game says the end. But what we know is that, Link came there, talked to Zelda, told him who he was, told him that every single thing I know what's going to happen, and he can prove it without a beginning of a doubt. Ganondorf's there too, so when he's there with in the audience chamber with the king, he proves to Link that there's something wrong here and you shouldn't trust this man. And then Ganondorf's like, how did he come up with all this knowledge? And then so they finally believe him, and then they throw Ganondorf in the chambers, and we get the idea of how this works. But anyways, the idea is that if we were to think about it even further, that Ganondorf, essentially, they just wrecked him at this point. Like, there's nothing he could have done. He lost at the end of the game. And at the same time, though, he still killed the Great Deku Tree. So everything up until the first half of the game, like, Link grew up in the Great Deku Tree, because he returned into his original timeline in Ocarina of Time. So, like, at the end of the game, the Great Deku Tree was still dead, and Link just kind of returned back to that moment when he first met Zelda, and then he told her everything. But all the things that happened up until the first dungeon, and then we met Zelda, that's where it pretty much ended. If that makes sense. It should, because, that's when he met Zelda for the first time. So all the events that happened up until that point didn't get erased. That still happened. The Great Deku Tree was dead. Link didn't meet any of the other people beyond... At least not yet. So in other words, the 7 sages in this timeline, up until this point, were still alive. Because what's really interesting is, before Zelda sends Link back into the future, kind of going back a little bit further, like during the credits, surprisingly, Link is actually still, like, the timeline still existed, like 7 years in the future. But, like, what was really interesting, though, was that the 7 sages, like, you can see their spirits. Like, they all smile at each other and they descend into the afterlife. But what's really interesting, though, is that they technically weren't dead as soon as Link went back in time, because he erased that from happening. So they weren't necessarily, like, or at least, because once Link goes back in time, like, when we see Link putting the Master Sword back, he now enters the childhood timeline, where then, the same Link goes to Majora's Mask, and then later to Twilight Princess. And this would make sense, because in Twilight Princess, for example, we see Ganondorf getting executed. So in the time between the time this game happens, the king is taking Ganondorf and putting him in there. And then later on, we find out that the timeline where Link went 7 years into the future, this is Wind Waker, the adult timeline. Because what had happened was, if you actually watch the introduction between when Ocarina of Time ends and then Wind Waker begins, it talks about how this is one of the many legends that the people speak of. And they talk about how long ago there was an ancient land. And they're talking about Hyrule in this case. You know, it lived through prosperity, and it was overrun by an evil man. But then they started telling it from the people's perspective, how they praised the gods, and they said, could you guys save us from Ganondorf? And, you know, there wasn't really anything they could have done. So, you know, people died, and then there was like all this fire and ominous darkness. But then out of nowhere, a hero emerged. So, like, these people... Like, this timeline still existed, but, like, and then people were still living in it, but then Link just kind of, like a time portal opened up somewhere, and Link just appeared out of nowhere. Like, this guy was obviously from that time period, but he wasn't from that time period, like from that 7 years, though. This was just, you know, Link just appeared out of nowhere, and he came there. Not too far away from the timeline, because, again, 7 years, but, you know, when he showed up, he was ready to kick Ganon's ass after he knew where he was at, and he had everything he needed. I mean, in the future, after he gathered all the knowledge and everything he needed. But then after Link went back in time, they didn't really know who the hero was because they never really stopped and asked him. But they knew that he existed and they did all these things for him. But then, you know, peace was restored again. But then Ganondorf came back again. But this time the hero didn't come back. It wasn't because he was dead in this timeline. It was because the same Link that saved Hyrule the first time in Wind Waker, he was already in Majora's Mask, so he couldn't be in two places at once, at least in this case. Because Link was already in Termina, trying to figure out what was going on there. So anyways, that's how that worked out. And then so we have the Wind Waker Link. When, you know, so at the beginning of Link, you know, we find out that your sister is trying to find you. And, you know, Link, the reincarnated Link that's in this game, they mention, like, it's a different Link. They talk about how there was another hero before this Link, and that, you know, essentially he was reincarnated as a hero in this dimension. But the idea is that the 7 sages are dead in this timeline, for example, because like later on, once you get the Master Sword, you can go to the Temple of Time, and you can actually see where the Master Sword is. If you kind of look around the outside perimeter, you can see, like, go on YouTube if you don't believe me and just watch type it in. Like, there's people that will show you, like, there are, like, you can see, like, a memorial setting was plattered, like, on the, like, you know how, like, if you go to a church, for example, you see, like, all the glass window shards that they make and all that. Well, they did that with the 7 sages, and so, like, the 7 sages are still being remembered for what they did, so they're technically dead. However, what's really interesting is in the child timeline, they're not dead, even though I mentioned that. So that's one of the many things that are really interesting. But that's how that worked out, though. So then Ganondorf comes back, but then we know that Wind Waker, you know, Link did something about it and killed him. And then, you know, this is why Ganondorf has all this backstory in this game, because he talks about how, you know, he fought the hero many times, and, you know, he told him that, you know, he could not understand why he wouldn't just let him do what he wanted to do. You know, because Ganondorf kind of mentioned, like, you know, the only reason he was doing what he was doing was because he came from a place that was literally Death Valley. You know, he was trying to save his own people. But he did it by waging war with other countries. Kind of interesting. But anyways, but then let's talk about the failure timeline. The one that, now, I'll be honest with you. I mean, I know people say that, you know, the hero died, but I'm technically not convinced by that, sort of. Because if you think about it, Link just kind of, maybe he went back in time one too many times that he changed the timeline, because, again, parallel dimensions. Again, the game theorist, Matt Pat, even made a video about this, explaining this very well. So, like, we go with Ocarina of Time, A Link to the Past. Again, different Link throughout the whole series. But we know that these Links are essentially not the same Ocarina of Time Link. The way I look at it, maybe at some point, Link created another timeline somehow, and then another Link was needed to save that world because nobody would merge up to stop Ganondorf in that timeline. Or maybe when Ganondorf was being sealed somehow, he cloned himself somehow and he was able to get into this dimension somehow. You know what I mean? It's a fantasy, yes, but I mean, but you never know. You know, we don't really know specifically what happened to Link. You know, well, you know, he could have just disappeared somewhere, and you know, and he wasn't there. You know, much like this timeline, you know, when Ganondorf came back the second time, you know. So that kind of explains like the Zelda timeline, you know, just a little bit. You know, great games if you never played them. And it can be very confusing because that's what a lot of people are confused about. You know, it's not that, you know, the Ocarina of Time didn't really explain what happened. It's just that, you know, there's just all these events that happen in Ocarina of Time, and, you know, because Link goes back in time, and then at the same time he kind of jumped several places. It's like, well, okay, you know, where exactly, what changed and what didn't? You know, that's what people are confused about in these timelines. But just kind of think about what I told you. You know, think about like before these three. See, when this game breaks off into these three timelines, from this to Wind Waker to A Link to the Past to Majora's Mask, these are the most important, crucial keys to being able to figure out the games after it. And the games before it obviously are pretty self-explanatory because this is before Ocarina of Time. So those are pretty like a one-way ticket. Makes sense. But I hope that explains everything, sort of. I mean, again, there's some more details, but you know, you essentially get the idea. Ocarina of Time, great game if you never played it, and it doesn't have to be confusing every time you see the ending. So hopefully that helps out a lot. And please comment, rate, and subscribe, favorite, share this video if you want videos like this. If you have any other request videos you want me to make, just kind of like talking about and explaining something, I will.